Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We have breaking news. Just before we came to air, there is a report from Reuters that Mark Hurd has passed away. Hurd has been the Oracle co-CEO along with Safra Catz. Of course, Larry Ellison is the chair there. We will be having more on this coming out a few moments from now with our colleague Brad Stone out in San Francisco. So once again, reports are that Mark Hurd, co-CEO of Oracle, has passed away. On the brief today, in the meantime, from London, Edward Evans on the Prime Minister Johnson's big Brexit vote in Parliament tomorrow, Kevin Cirilli from the White House on the state of the precarious ceasefire along the northeast Syrian border, and Tom Orlik in Washington on the disappointing China growth numbers out overnight. So, Edward, let's start with you. What do we expect in Parliament tomorrow? Is this really the showdown?
It may or it may not be the showdown is the short answer. But Johnson is taking the Brexit deal he reached with the EU this week to Parliament for a vote. But it may not happen. MPs have put down an amendment that would essentially delay the vote until next week and force Johnson to seek an extension. So on one level, we could get a vote in favour of a deal, though Johnson looks very short on the numbers. But quite possibly it could be delayed till next week.
So, in fact, could he get an extension from the EU at this point? There was some noise out of Brussels that they were sort of tired of the extensions already.
Yeah. Johnson himself, of course, has said he does not want to seek an extension. Macron came out today, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, came out today saying that Britain shouldn't get an extension. I think bear in mind, though, that Macron has been a long-time opponent of giving Britain an extension. Back in April, he was opposed to giving Britain an extension. But again, Europe did grant an extension in the end. That might actually be helpful for Johnson if he's to frame this debate to MPs as it's my deal or no deal.
So, Edward, as the whips over there are counting the votes, what is the most critical set of votes that the Prime Minister needs to get?
His own Brexiters need to fall inside. He hasn't got the support of the DUP. They've come out very firmly and said they're not going to support the bill. Now, Johnson needs the DUP votes to get legislation through Parliament. Or he needs to get all of his MPs on side, including those who haven't supported him so far. And on top of that, he needs to win over Labour waverers. Now, these are Labour MPs in Leave voting seats who are looking at their majorities going, what happens if I vote this bill down? They're going to come under intense pressure from the Labour Party not to back Johnson. So that's really the key group, I think, to watch tomorrow.
OK, Edward, thank you so very much. That's Bloomberg Brexit editor Edward Evans reporting from London. And now we go to Kevin Cirilli at the White House. So, Kevin, we had the dramatic announcement from Vice President Pence over in Ankara yesterday of a ceasefire. Is it holding in northeast Syria?
Well, as of now, reports are that the administration has been able to secure a 5-day ceasefire with Turkey and the Kurds. It comes at a time in which Republicans on Capitol Hill have been pressing the administration to get to some type of more aggressive stance against Turkey. It also comes following an elongated meeting between Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Turkish President Erdogan. Now, in speaking with sources in the past 24 hours here in Congress and in Washington, D.C., the pressure is mounting on President Trump for what comes on day 6. Will this be a prolongated type of deal, or will this just be very temporary? Either way, the president yesterday here at the White House offering a celebratory remarks of sorts, saying that it was a deal that no other politician or administration was able to get. It also received praise from Senator Lindsey Graham, a Republican from South Carolina, David, who had been quite critical. But again, everyone now just waiting to see what comes next.
OK, Kevin, talking about a ceasefire, is there a ceasefire within the White House when it comes to the Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney? Because he came out and gave that dramatic press conference yesterday, news conference, in which he essentially said, yes, in fact, we withheld some funds because we wanted an investigation to go on, and now he sort of walked it back.
Yes, definitely he walked it back. Jay Sekulow, one of the president's legal counsel, releasing a statement saying that they did not consult with the president's chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, during that marathon press conference. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice also releasing a statement following that press conference yesterday here at the White House, in which they said that they do not operate in the sense of there being a quid pro quo of sorts with regards to negotiations internationally. Either way, I can tell you that based upon my reporting, Mick Mulvaney continues to have good standing with the one individual who it matters for, and that's President Trump. David?
Serve at the pleasure of the president, as I recall. OK, thanks so much to Kevin Cirilli at the White House. Now we go to Tom Orlik. He's our chief economist at Bloomberg Economics. Tom, we had some pretty important numbers out of China overnight. I guess they were somewhat disappointing.
Yeah, that's right, David. 6% GDP growth for China in the third quarter. Now, clearly, 6% is not a disaster. At the same time, it was disappointing for a couple of reasons. The first was that it missed expectations. Consensus forecast was for a 6.1% reading. This was a little bit below it. The second reason it was disappointing was, well, in China, if you're going to miss, you better miss by a lot to spark market expectations of stimulus. This was a miss, but it wasn't a significant miss, so growth continues to grind lower, but expectations of government stimulus support remain very limited.
Okay, Tom, thank you so much for reporting from Washington today. That's Tom Orlik. He's chief economist at Bloomberg Economics. And now we want to return to that breaking sad news. There is a report from Reuters that Mark Hurd has passed away. Hurd has been this co-CEO of Oracle and had been on a medical leave since September for unspecified reasons. Joining us now from San Francisco is Bloomberg Technology senior executive editor Brad Stone. So, Brad, what do we know?
Yeah, David. Well, Mark Hurd was really an icon in Silicon Valley, just a common presence here, really, since I've started covering technology. Turned around HP in his 5 years as CEO. HP, one of the decades-old linchpins of Silicon Valley, really, he was known as a cost cutter. I remember stories, where he was unplugging the Coca-Cola machines to save money and downsizing, a company that had grown fat and sort of inflexible. Went over to Oracle, became co-CEO with Safra Catz in 2013, and was really the most prominent senior executive at Oracle. Helped to reorient Oracle towards the cloud. He was, the guy, the salesman who was out there all the time. I was fortunate enough to interview him at an Oracle World a couple of years ago, and it's a big loss for Silicon Valley and for Oracle.
Well, exactly, a towering figure, I think it's fair to say. As I say, Reuters has reported he's passed away. We knew he had medical problems. With respect to Oracle in particular, how much does it affect them? Because when he took the medical leave of absence, as I recall, they said, we do have a co-CEO, and of course, Larry Ellison's still there as chair.
It's interesting revisiting the circumstances of that announcement last month. Bloomberg, we had the news that he had stepped back from his day-to-day activities, that he was ill. Oracle hadn't made an announcement. They were hoping not to perhaps have to make an announcement. And I think it goes to how important Mark Hurd is to the company, that he's the public face. I mean, up until we were prepared to write our article and then Oracle went and announced that he was taking a leave of absence, Mark Hurd was still the keynote speaker at Oracle in September. So I think it speaks to his importance. They don't really have anyone who can grab the limelight and communicate to customers. And Oracle's in the midst of a very difficult transition, moving its legacy software business into the cloud. Just last week, Amazon declared that they were moving all their Oracle implementations to their own cloud-based databases. So, Oracle's having a sort of existential moment right now. Mark Hurd was one of the guys that could make that transition, and I think they're going to miss him.
So as you look at his legacy, Brad, would you say it's more that he was a visionary, or was he somebody who could get it done, who could bring the troops together, rally them, and point them in a given direction and motivate them?
Yeah, he was not I wouldn't call him a visionary. I never saw really his strengths with R&D in particular. He was an operator. He was a sales guy. He could articulate the vision. And it was a vision that went beyond the companies he worked for. He was actually a real proponent of professional tennis. He started the Indian Wells Pro Tennis Tournament. He was a big advocate for tennis players attending college. So he had this kind of larger-than-life persona that extended beyond his day job. I think his legacy is going to be pretty comprehensive in that regard.
Okay, many thanks, Brad. Really appreciate you joining us on short notice. That's Bloomberg's Brad Stone reporting from San Francisco on the passing, reportedly, of Mark Hurd of Oracle. Now it's time to check on the markets and find out what's going on today. So, Abigail, there's a little bit of market movement. What's causing it?
Well, we were a bit flat on the open. Now we're looking at modest declines, a little bit of a risk-off tone of those macro headlines that you were just talking about. Maybe the China growth weighing a little bit of a disappointment there. And if you break those down a little bit more, the industrial component, 5.3%, really missing missing the mark. So some folks perhaps nervous. But it comes back to earnings. We're looking at a slew of earnings reports on the day. And looking ahead to next week, the big drag on the day is the technology sector, down more than 1%. Microsoft there almost down 2%. No news. In fact, there's some positive analyst news there, but nonetheless, the stock's down. They report next week. As you know, the stock has been on fire over the last couple of years. So maybe investors taking some chips off the table ahead of that report.
Exactly, which raises the question, is this because of some unpleasant development, or is it actually just it had gone a little too far too fast, has to come down a little bit?
Probably a little bit too far too fast. Some managers wanting to lock in some profits. Last year was so brutal. So if you have a big winner like this, maybe take some chips off the table ahead of their fiscal first quarter. Let's see what they signal on the year ahead.
Earlier in the day, consumer staples were actually doing pretty well, too. Does that indicate a little bit of some risk off, a little concern about how much risk?
You're absolutely right about that, because if we were to take a look at what's happening sector-wise, most sectors are lower. The sectors that are higher, consumer staples, real estate, and utilities, those are the defensive sectors. So the fact that you have investors going that way tells you that they are positioning just a little bit defensively as the week ends. That being said, we are looking at the second up week in a row for the S&P 500, the third up week in a row for the NASDAQ, if tech can hold on.
There you go. Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle. And now we turn to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson may not even get the chance to put his Brexit deal to a vote on Saturday. Support's growing for a move by an alliance of former Conservatives and opposition members of Parliament to delay the decision by a week or more. The amendment would withhold approval for the Brexit deal until the bill that implements it is law. If it passed, Johnson would be unable to put his deal to a vote, forcing him to seek a Brexit delay. A 5-day ceasefire, or what some are calling a pause, has taken effect in Syria. Still, there are reports of fighting taking place between Turkish and Kurdish forces. Vice President Pence and Turkey's President Recep Erdogan agreed on the truce yesterday after a meeting in Ankara. Kurdish fighters who were once U.S. allies will be forced to retreat from the battlefield, and Turkish forces will not withdraw. Spain says it will punish rioters in Catalonia. Mass protests are being held over the imprisonment of Catalan separatists. Speaking to reporters in Brussels after a meeting of European leaders today, Spain's interim Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says his country guarantees freedom to protest, but he vowed to prosecute radicals who rioted this week. Nationwide protests paralyzed Lebanon today as demonstrators blocked major roads in a second day of rallies. Protesters are angered about the government's handling of a severe economic crisis and the entire country's political class. Lebanon is already on the verge of collapse and has one of the highest debt loads in the world. Some of the protesters say they will stay in the streets until the government resigns. Global news, 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, did he or didn't he? Some said it seemed like Mick Mulvaney admitted a quid pro quo with Ukraine on national television. But the acting White House chief of staff says he didn't. Did his defense of the president actually make matters worse? We're going to ask our panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
The look back to what happened in 2016 certainly was part of the thing that he was worried about in corruption with that nation. And that is absolutely appropriate.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happened as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
That was the acting White House Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, speaking yesterday in a White House press briefing. We welcome now our political panel of Jen Kern. She's Republican strategist and founder of Women for a Great America, and Jason Green, co-founder of SkillSmart and former associate White House counsel under President Obama. So we heard Mick Mulvaney say that. Then people said, well, that sounds like you admitted a quid pro quo. He then came out and said, no, you're misconstruing it. That's not what I said. It sounded an awful lot like he said, yes, if you didn't go forward with the investigation, I'm not going to give you the money. Is he right? Shouldn't he just say, I got it wrong?
Well, look, anytime you're clarifying, you're losing. That is the number one rule of being a press secretary for the last 15 years. He also violated another golden rule, which is don't ever contradict the boss, especially when you serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States. So that was bad. It was a bad day for Mick Mulvaney yesterday. The good news is most Americans don't know the difference between Mick Mulvaney and Dermot Mulroney. So I think this is much ado about nothing. Look, when it comes to aid, there's no question in the history of the United States, we have given aid and expect certain behaviors in return for that aid. If we're giving you aid, we expect no human rights violations. If we're giving you aid, we expect no corruption or a reduction in corruption. So this aid business is as old as time. I'm not sure why the Democrats are uber focused on it, but it's been going on for quite some time.
Well, let's turn to a Democrat. Does it have something to do with the fact that the investigation you wanted was of the Democrats?
Well, I don't think that this is even a partisan point here. I mean, frankly, when you talk about a golden rule that we have, the golden rule that, the organization that was really hurt by all this is the United States. Yesterday was a dark day, not for the Republicans, not for the White House, but for the United States to realize that we're engaging in our foreign policy through quid pro quos. Exactly the point that you just made, David, the fact that what we're talking about here is encouraging, withholding foreign aid only to the condition of whether or not you're going to be able to investigate our political rivals. That's a significant concern. It's not the way that foreign policy has or should be dictated.
Now, Jen, not to argue your case for me, but it's important that the thing he apparently sort of confessed to was not a quid pro quo for investigating Vice President Biden and his son. Right. It was rather what happened in the 2016 election, whether there was some shenanigans going on there.
That's right. And if you look at the actual transcript, which I pulled up, Trump actually says in that Ukraine transcript of the call, I would like you to do us a favor, though. I would like you to find out what happened with Ukraine. They say the CrowdStrike server. Now, if you look at the American sentiment on this, Politico and other polls show 60% of Americans do still care about who meddled in the 2016 election. That is the core of what Donald Trump is
very
getting
well
to.
done, but there's another part of that transcript that says the favor is to investigate Vice President Biden and his son. But let's.
And I think that is where the president went wrong, and I think that's where
it's in the transcript that he disclosed.
In both instances, it's where the president went wrong. I mean, I think it's amazing that we're going to try and draw this false line about investigating the 2016 election. For this, it's okay. For this, it isn't okay. I think that we can all agree, right, that this is the business that the White House should not be dealing in.
So let's talk about the 2020 election, if we could, because social media is going to play a large role in that, okay? And we had Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, yesterday, have, I thought, a fairly remarkable statement about what role Facebook has or it doesn't have. This is part of what he said.
While I certainly worry about an erosion of truth, I don't think most people want to live in a world where you can only post things that tech companies judge to be 100% true. We don't fact-check political ads, and we don't do this to help politicians, but because we think people should be able to see for themselves what politicians are saying.
So I don't know, we may have bilateral agreement here, bipartisan agreement on this one, because it strikes me, okay, well, it's one thing to say we're not going to hold you responsible, but New York Times is responsible for what it publishes and whether it's false or true. Why should Facebook be different, Jen?
Well, I'm just glad to see Facebook and at least one company in Silicon Valley going back to the free market principles that they claim they were founded on. I remember a time when I was in Silicon Valley that they were, fair-minded, open-minded, and I'm glad to see Facebook returning to letting the people decide.
But so you're in favor of Facebook just saying it's not my responsibility. You can put anything up there you want, true, false, whatever it is.
They're
it's
not
okay.
putting anything up. They still have this tribunal, I call it, of 40 people that are going to come together and adjudicate and serve as sort of a court of appeals of controversial items posted, such as presidential ads. But look, I think you have to let the content be there and let the American people decide. The American voters are always smarter than the pundits and the Democrats give them credit for.
So that's an interesting point of view. We don't do that with the New York Times. We don't do that with ABC News and things like that. This is a whole different model, which says let 1,000 flowers bloom. The people will figure it out. Is that a good way to do it?
I was just going to say this last point, something we can actually agree on that the American people. That last part of Jen's point is that the American people are often much smarter than what the punditry is going to give them credit for. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that yesterday one of the lions of the Congress passed away. Elijah Cummings, representative of my home district, Maryland Congressional 7th. And we know that he said, when we look back and we're dancing with the angels, which he is right now, we have to wonder, what did we do to keep our democracy from faltering? I don't think that the answer that we saw from Zuckerberg is a good answer to what we're going to do, what they're trying to do to keep this democracy from faltering. He's going to Representative Cummings' point was you have to do something, and I see the Facebook response now is taking their hands off of the wheel and saying it's not our responsibility to do anything.
Well, it's interesting. Your basic position, as I understand it, Jen, is he's fine as long as he does it both ways. The problem is maybe you think had his thumb on the scale a little bit. But isn't that an open invitation to Russians, Ukrainians, North Koreans, whatever, to come in and try to manipulate our political process?
Well, I think that Facebook has already put those safeguards in place. As someone who does social media buying for clients, it's awfully hard to actually take out an ad on Facebook. You have to have an American landline number. You have to have ID. You have to have an American driver's license. So there are a number of safeguards that Facebook has put into place. But again, I think leaving the judgment to the American people is always the best thing. In the recent ad that President Trump ran, the American people can figure out for themselves. And don't forget, David, we still have a free press in this country, even though President calls it fake news and the news media thinks he's too hard on them. The bottom line is we very much still have the First Amendment in this country. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having all these discussions. And I think you have to report on this and let the American people decide. And I'm glad to see Facebook going back to those free market principles.
Quickly.
The reality is it's just not the way that we engage in communications today. Yeah. When the American public engages with a platform like Facebook, it's not because it's one medium of many mediums. They're not going to engage 7 different media outlets to get their news. It's a heightened responsibility that Facebook and other
all I guess the backdrop of regulation. Sorry, we're going to have to leave it, come back and do it again. Thanks to our political panel of Jen Kearns and Jason Green. Still ahead, Bank of England Governor Mark Carney joins us from the IMF meetings in Washington. His thoughts on the new Brexit deal and much more. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Breaking news now. Boeing shares are tumbling. The FAA is accusing the company of withholding information on the 737 MAX. The FAA says it's going to be releasing further details today. We'll report those as they develop. Time now for the stock of the hour besides Boeing, which will be the stock of the hour. L Brands is the worst performer on the S&P 500 today, dropping about 8% after getting a downgrade at Credit Suisse. Kayla Lyons can explain it to us. Kayla.
Yeah, well, as we know, L Brands has been underperforming for quite some time. Some idiosyncratic factors at play there, but this is actually part of a wider downgrade from Credit Suisse. It also cut Macy's and Gap. Basically, the thesis from the analyst over there is that the fall and holiday season is not going to look great because pressures that already are existing are going to continue. We saw weaker retail sales this month, specifically in department stores, which have been weaker pretty much for the duration of this year. Also, the weather, of course, a classic blame for the retailers, but that warmer weather, if it extends into the fall, could mean more inventory of things like sweaters. And then, as we know, tariffs also a big issue here. You had the apparel tariffs, 40% of clothing, 70% of footwear come from China, and those tariffs, the vast majority of them, already hit on September 1st, so that's an issue. And then he's also noting that the holiday shopping season is significantly shorter this year because Thanksgiving is literally at the bitter end of November, so the days in between Thanksgiving and Christmas are fewer. All of that, he says, are headwinds going into this holiday season, so it's not a very pretty picture he's painting for these retailers.
And that's before you get to December 15 and maybe some more tariffs.
Exactly.
Just to make it more complicated. Okay, many thanks to Kayla Lyons now, reporting on those retailers. Up next, Bank of England Mark Carney. He is going to be on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. He's going to be coming to us from Washington, where the IMF and the World Bank are meeting. This is Bloomberg. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, the United States is trying to reassure Israel that the relationship between the two nations remains as strong as ever. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem today, a day after Turkey agreed to halt its offensive against Kurdish forces in Syria. Some have expressed fears that President Trump's desire to get out of what he called stupid, endless wars in the Middle East makes him an unreliable ally as Israel faces threats from Iran. In Afghanistan, more than 60 people have been killed in a mosque explosion. Officials say dozens of others were wounded. The attack took place as dozens of people gathered inside the mosque to offer weekly Friday prayers. There was no immediate claim of responsibility. Mexico's president says he backed a decision by security chiefs to free the son of jailed drug kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in order to protect lives. Security forces captured Ovidio Guzman Thursday during a patrol. In response, hundreds of heavily armed cartel members carried out a series of attacks across the city. Joaquin Guzman's two sons, including Ovidio, are thought to have played key roles in the Sinaloa cartel since their father was extradited in 2017 to the United States, where he is now serving a life sentence. Leaders of the Pittsburgh synagogue, where worshipers were fatally shot last year, want to rebuild and renovate the building. Tree of Life leaders outlined their vision for a building today, saying they hope it will be a center for Jewish life in the United States and a symbol against hatred. A gunman opened fire at the synagogue last October, killing 11 people and wounding 7. The building has remained closed since the attack. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and at TikTok, on Twitter, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. I spoke with former Federal Reserve Governor Dan Tarullo earlier today, and one of the things we talked about was the effect that the Federal Reserve has on inflation expectations.
What you see at the Fed, I think, are disagreements or uncertainties about 3 big issues. First, to what degree is this a secular problem? You know, inflation is just stuck below target on a long-run basis. Second, to what degree are the cyclical factors a little bit behind us now or still to come? The next issue is kind of related, but more important than maybe people understand. You know, the traditional idea has been that if you're close to the zero lower bound, you want to act proactively because you're not going to have that much room to stimulate if you go into recession. And so for several years, I and other people on the Fed, I think, subscribe to this notion that you are very careful about then raising rates because you don't want to do anything that might tip you into recession. I think there's some question now among some of the Fed FOMC members as to whether that approach is actually efficacious, given that the risks are things like trade and geopolitical uncertainty. And then third, I think the Fed has got itself a little bit in a position where the markets are expecting more stimulus, and they may be a bit worried that if they don't deliver it, they may induce a little bit of a shock from the markets as opposed to assuaging the markets.
So if the Fed has to choose between the markets expecting something and inflation expectations on the other hand, which do they pick? Because isn't part of the problem inflation expectations are suppressed in part because the Fed keeps cutting? I'll put a chart up here, actually, that indicates inflation expectations are really suppressed. If they keep cutting and say they're going to keep cutting, of course inflation expectations are suppressed.
Well, there's partly a communication problem, I think, David, because in theory, what the Fed would hope would happen is, as they cut rates because they say we are trying to assure that we meet inflation expectations and meet the target by stimulating more growth. But there is this question as to what is actually affecting inflation expectations. And the latest New York Fed survey suggested that expectations are becoming a bit unanchored.
Well, in fairness to the marketplace, in terms of inflation expectations, they've tried it again and again. It hasn't worked. So at some point, the marketplace says, you know what, we don't believe that by cutting rates, it's going to increase inflation.
Well, yeah, so you've got the difference between consumer expectations and market expectations. The market expectations are pretty easy to quantify because you just look at the differences in yields. Consumer expectations, though, which should play a big part in the operation of expectations, those have been better anchored, at least up until recently.
Welcome to our TV viewers and radio listeners worldwide. I'm Francine Lacroix at the IMF World Bank meetings for a conversation with Mark Carney, the Governor of the Bank of England. Governor, thank you for giving us a little bit of your time.
Thanks for having me, Francine.
When you look at the latest Brexit developments, we understand there's a vote, there could not be a vote. Are we looking at a possible extension? Are we looking at a deal? What are the implications for monetary policy?
Well, there's many different paths, as your question indicates, and obviously we will see which path is chosen and then react accordingly. The good news is that there is an agreement between the UK and the European Union, and that as a consequence of that agreement, if it's adopted, would be that there would be a transition, an orderly transition to a new economic relationship. And we have been saying, the Bank of England's been saying from day one after the referendum, after the decision of the people of the United Kingdom to move to a new economic relationship, broader relationship with the EU, that it was important to have a transition to that relationship, and that's what this deal would deliver if it is adopted.
But so what does that actually mean for rates? Could a rate hike be back on the table?
It's hard to distill it down to one thing. It depends the nature of adoption, the time frame in which it happens. I mean, there are lots of potential paths, but transition's better than jumping, clearly better than the alternative, and the alternative is a no-deal Brexit at the end of this month. In general, what we have seen in the UK, and I would like to generalize the point, but I'll stick with the UK, is that this entrenched uncertainty about trade relationships, and this is the tightest trade relationship in the world between the UK and the rest of the EU at present, this entrenched uncertainty about it is having a consequence for business investment. We think business investment, the level is about 25% below where it otherwise would have been post-referendum. Now, if this is adopted, it will remove much of that uncertainty. We would expect a rebound in some of that investment. It won't all come back, obviously, because we don't know the exact nature of the future relationship. The future relationship is still to be negotiated, but we do know that the prospect of an orderly transition is put in place, and we do know the broad contours. In that environment, you would expect, all things being equal, and they're not always equal, but all things being equal, the economy to pick up from what has been quite a subdued pace, and that makes monetary policy a little more interesting.
And so that would be including interest rate hikes?
Not necessarily. I'm not going to pre-commit. And there's a lot of contingencies there. We also we're sitting here, and this is why I wanted to generalize the point. We're sitting here at the IMF meetings, and as you know, the characterization of the fund of the global economy is precarious, that the momentum in the global economy is precarious. Now, that's new. That has built up over the course of the last 18 months. Why is it built up? The principal reason is global trade tensions, particularly tensions between the United States and China, the United States and Europe. And as a consequence of that is you're seeing globally now what we have been seeing in the UK. So we have to take that into account. How much momentum is there in the global economy? Are we stabilizing now? Is that about to pick up? So you take all these factors into account and make the rate decision at the appointed time.
We're having a conversation with Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, at the IMF World Bank meetings. Is there a stark division on the MPC on how you would deal with a no-deal Brexit?
No.
And so you would deal with it with...
Well, there is not a division in terms of the overall approach. The approach is guided by achieving the inflation target, the 2% inflation target, using the flexibility we have under our remit, our mandate, to adjust the time frame over which we would return inflation to target, likely from above in the event of a no-deal Brexit because of currency impacts on inflation. But the exact judgments about what no deal does to the supply capacity of the economy, particularly, different individuals will form their own judgments on that. These are very difficult judgments to be, so there may be a range of views around that. But overall monetary strategy, no, there's not a division, and we would address it if we had to. I would remind, though, that it's not just about monetary policy in that event. We have many other tools, so-called macroprudential tools, and the Financial Policy Committee has signaled that it would be expected to move quickly.
But if there's a no-deal Brexit, how quickly could you react to a no-deal?
Well, we would react in the normal time frame. We'd be deliberate about it. There's not. Look, in terms of the financial, we have reacted to the prospect of a no-deal Brexit over the course of the last 3 years. We have put the core of the financial system in a position that it is ready for any potential outcome in Brexit, and that's our job. We're very confident about that. Now, today we're sitting here in a different framework where there is a deal. It's a question of whether or not it is going to be adopted, but it is a deal which, if it is adopted, gives the prospect of transition to a new relationship.
Right. What about an extension? So would you be in favor for a 3-month extension or a 9-month extension? And again, what does that mean for uncertainty?
Well, look, it's not our responsibility. The question on the table, and parliamentarians are, taking their responsibilities extremely seriously and debating it, is that, as you would expect, is to determine whether or not to adopt this deal, and we'll find out relatively short order. We are prepared for all eventualities.
We've seen quite a lot of volatility on pound.
Obviously, this absolutely. This drives the currency. It drives economic prospects in the medium term. These are quite different paths to move to WTO trading terms overnight, or to have a very smooth adjustment to what compared to WTO would be a much deeper trading relationship.
Are you surprised
and
by
of course
that volatility?
That's it. Not at all. We've been saying, look, at points we were criticized because we observed that we would expect a fair bit of volatility in the pound because of these. But it's.
You also called it an emerging market.
Well, no, I observed that the level of volatility, which you can type up on your Bloomberg screen and verify that I'm right. Somebody's probably doing it right now. But the level of vol on sterling, the major pairs for sterling cable and others, is the same level of vol as major emerging market crosses. That's a fact, and that has been a fact for a while. But that's because big economic issues are being decided almost as we speak.
We're in conversation with Mark Carney, the Bank of England governor. We're talking, of course, about Brexit, about pound volatility.
Of course, we're talking about that.
If you talk about emerging markets, is there an emerging market currency that you look to try and see how you could stabilize pound?
No. How's that for a short answer? No. This is a unique situation. It's the deepest, most integrated economic relationship in the world, right, between countries, and there is going to be a substantial change to the level of integration, and therefore the financial markets, and it's most immediately expressed in sterling, but we see it in the gilt curve, and we see it in UK-focused equities, we see it in UK commercial real estate. Assets are repriced. Yep. You see it across the board because these are big. It is a wide range of potential economic outcomes. There's more positive developments in recent days and weeks, and there's a prospect again. Let me underscore one important point. It's not just the financial sector is ready for Brexit, but this is one of the most flexible economies in the world. Balance sheets are in good shape, household balance sheets, corporate balance sheets in good shape, financial system in good shape. With transition, this economy will adjust.
But how difficult is it to do forecasts in this? Should you just abandon
it's difficult.
Forecasts?
One is doing scenarios as opposed to forecasts because there are very different scenarios whether we have a smooth transition to a deeper relationship versus whether we have no deal. Those are. And so you can't just take those two scenarios and do the average of them and say that's what's going to happen. No, these are bimodal outcomes.
If there's an extension, how much is the global economy going to weigh on this if we don't have a trade deal?
Well, the global economy is going to weigh on this regardless, right? And again, also one of the most open economies in the world. It's no secret that one of the jurisdictions that's been most affected by global weakness is Europe, and the heartland of Europe, Germany in particular. Your next guest can talk to that, I'm sure. Now, we're not as pessimistic as some are about those prospects, but it is having an effect on the margin on the UK, as you would expect. And the big question at these meetings is, are we stabilizing? Is the global economy as a whole stabilizing? And is that prospect of picking up next year there? Is macro policy right globally? Is there enough monetary stimulus? Is fiscal going to come in behind? And above it all, though, is what should not be an irreducible uncertainty, but is starting to feel like one, is around trade. And look, you can't lean against that. You can't substitute for it. That's what you've seen in the UK, the orders of magnitude of the effect. The UK may have led the world into this. We may be leading the world out of this if this goes forward.
Would you stay on as governor of the Bank of England if you were asked to do so?
What I've committed to do is to stay on, and I have, in order to ensure there's a smooth transition to my successor, and candidly as well, and I've been clear about this, is kind of to put myself where my mouth has been. In other words, to be in this seat at this critical time. So whatever happens, whatever path we're forward, the preparations that we put in place, it's all fine and good for me to say, don't worry, the financial system's ready and I'm off back to Canada and good luck. No, I'm here at this moment in order to do that. And then the next phase is, a decision will be made, and then
But if you get
then the
asked.
government. No, look, the government's got plenty of time to choose a successor. There's many qualified candidates. They will make a decision at the appropriate time. Not surprisingly.
Are you
not
telling me we'll
surprisingly.
see?
Well, it will happen in due course, and I recall that highly successful president of the European Central Bank was selected weeks before he took office. Mario Draghi came in weeks before he took office. This is, these institutions are ready.
You talked a lot about crypto here. Where will the biggest shift in cryptocurrencies come from, or the biggest disruption?
To be candid, we didn't
or
talk.
Central banks?
In where? In Central
The biggest disruption for cryptocurrencies.
Well, first off, we don't talk a lot about crypto, like that end, that fringe. I'm sorry, now I'm going to get a lot of hate, but that fringe of the sector, discussions on stable coins, really discussions about the future of the payment system. Like in the end, the core, we're going to preserve monetary sovereignty. The question is, where do you put the boundary between the public sector? Public sector money, that's us. The core public sector infrastructure, central bank infrastructure, and access to it, again, that's us. But you want to do it in a way, and we firmly believe this is the Bank of England, you want to do it in a way that allows for private innovation. There's absolutely a revolution in payments that can benefit all our citizens, can make the world much a more stable place. It can create huge opportunities for smaller businesses, great financial inclusion, and it can just shift. It can save people hundreds of millions of pounds per year in the UK. So we're interested in advancing that, but on our terms. And core point, this is not going to be social media. This is not going to be something happens and then the authorities run around after the fact and try to figure out how to regulate. No. We will gate this. We will gate these developments. We'll draw the right lines between where the public sector starts and stops. And it starts and stops it starts at money. Where beyond that it stops in the payment system remains to be determined.
Governor Carney, thank you so much for joining us. That was the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, here at the World Bank IMF meetings.
Okay, thanks so much to our colleague Francine Lacqua for a terrific interview with Bank of England Governor Mark Carney. And briefly, what he said, most of it was about Brexit, of course. He said that the news that there was a deal between the British government and the EU was good news, that he expected in the normal course that might increase investment. Investment would rebound. At the same time, he's not going to prejudge whether that meant increased interest rates in England, because there are other factors, including momentum, and that may be in effect feared by trade. He said there was no division among the Monetary Policy Committee over the approach if there is no deal. And he said, of course, this drives currency, and it is as volatile as emerging market currency. He didn't say it's not the same as emerging market currency, but the pound right now is just as volatile as emerging market currency. To really sort this out for us, we turn now to Bloomberg's senior executive editor for economics, Stephanie Flanders, visiting Washington from London for those IMF and World Bank meetings. So welcome, Stephanie. Great to have you here. Tell us what you took away from what Mark Carney has had to say. What did we learn?
Well, I think we learned that he was having the sort of pleasant job that he hasn't had for a while of being reassuring and positive about the prospect for the UK. In the UK, certainly he's been associated with the people who are his critics have said he was always talking up Project Fear, that he was always talking up the risks of no-deal Brexit or the costs of Brexit. He was actually in a mode here talking about how well prepared they were for any eventuality, how flexible the UK economy was to respond to any change as a result of Brexit. I thought it was an interesting take, and I think he did say something interesting. We've been saying for a while that the UK has indeed shown us how extreme political uncertainty, and particularly uncertainty around trade, can hurt your economy the last few years, and that was kind of a demonstration of what could and has been happening for the global economy. He made that explicit comparison and had that interesting thought that maybe if the UK was first into that particular rabbit hole, maybe it's come coming out as well first.
Yeah, that's the bright and shiny look at the whole thing, I think, as a practical matter. Stephanie, one of the things that Francine asked him about was, might this extend his term? And he said, basically, I've said I'll be there for the transition. It wasn't exactly clear whether he's maybe opening the door a crack for maybe that transition taking longer.
I mean, there's been this interesting question about whether his successor could be appointed if you had an election or a major disruption, but certainly an election looming in the short term. You know, it's very difficult for his successor to have credibility if he or she is appointed by someone who then is immediately voted out of office a month later. You know, you'd constantly have a kind of asterisk around that governor. So that's why there's been this continuous delay in the appointment of a successor. And there's been a question mark recently, if we were going to get an election in a couple of months, whether or not you should be appointing someone in that environment. But the truth is we don't know. And as he pointed out, we have until the end of January. So it's quite possible that a successor could be appointed before then.
Okay, Stephanie, always a treat to have you with us. Thanks so much. That's Bloomberg's Stephanie Flanders joining us from Washington. We want to go back down now to Washington. The IMF annual meetings. Francine Lacqua is standing by with another key player.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're focusing on Europe. David, we're joined by Olaf Scholz. He is the German finance minister. Minister, thank you for speaking to Bloomberg. Germany is, of course, holding a balanced budget. Partners want Germany to actually use a little bit more leeway to stimulate its ailing economy. What needs to happen that Germany gives up its balanced budget?
We have made a very expansive financial policy in the last years. At this time, we have the highest public investment in the federal budget. It's 40 billion euros a year, and it will be 400 billion in the next 10 years. This will be boosted in a way by our latest decisions on fighting climate change. This is an extra 150 billion euros investment for the next 10 years. So there's a lot of public investment. And this is in a situation where the economy is still stable. We have the highest number of people employed. If many people would enter Germany and knock at the right doors, they would be employed. So it is not a difficult situation.
Minister, can you do more? Can you enact more stimulus?
I think we did a lot, as I already said, looking at investment, and this is also due if we look at taxes. We decreased the taxes for low and middle income taxpayers. We helped families with child quite a lot, and we will have a tax relief in mostly demolishing the tax for which we took since the German unification. So 90% of the taxpayers will not pay this extra tax anymore. So anything is boosting the economy. In the end, the more important question is what will happen to a global economy, because this is the real question we all have to face.
We're in conversation with Olaf Scholz, the German finance minister. What makes you so optimistic, Minister, that Germany can return to growth by the end of the year?
We have a very competitive economy. This is not just the big companies anyone knows, but many Mittelstand companies who are successful on the world market. What we know is that we have a lowering of global growth, and we also know why this is so. It's because of trade tensions between the United States and China and other questions. So hopefully, if all these questions step by step are solved, like the Brexit seems to be, this will have a good impact on the world economy, because what we are now facing is that there are problems from new tariffs, but there is also the problem that the people are uncertain about the future, and so they do not take decisions. This is necessary to be changed.
But what happens if we don't have a Brexit deal? So we have a Brexit deal. What happens if it doesn't get voted through Parliament?
I think this will be very difficult, especially for the United Kingdom, because a hard Brexit would be a problem, to be very honest. And it is a problem for UK, it is a problem for the rest of the world, also the European Union, but mostly not there. There will be some effects. But it's always the same. The best thing to do is to make a very pragmatic political strategy, follow it, and this means that we should avoid all these tensions.
Minister, Christine Lagarde has been inaugurated as ECB president. She takes over on November 1st. Are you expecting more stimulus from the European Central Bank?
I think the European Central Bank followed a very clear strategy during the last years. They were very successful during the big crisis we had 10 years ago. And Christine Lagarde is a very intelligent person that is very experienced. She did a very good job at IMF. and I'm sure that she will do it very good at the ECB as well.
But can banks, especially German banks, take more negative rates? Can they cope with ever more negative rates?
It is something we fought very much for, that the European Central Bank is independent, and following this line, it is not a good idea that finance ministers or prime ministers or presidents comment the strategies of the central bank.
All right, a very diplomatic answer from the German finance minister in conversation with Olaf Scholz here at the IMF World Bank meetings in Washington, D.C.
Okay, thank you very much once again to Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua down in Washington for a fascinating interview with Olaf Scholz. He is the German finance minister, and he seems to be confident that, in fact, the German economy can return to growth, even though there have been some disappointing economic numbers out of Germany in recent days. He says they have a competitive economy in Germany. He says that the problem has been the global growth overall has been trending down. He blames that on trade tensions and to some extent on Brexit. He is hopeful that maybe some of those things could get resolved. If they don't, he says, particularly on Brexit, if it doesn't, it will hurt the UK. It will hurt the EU, and it will hurt the rest of the world. So that was Olaf Scholz speaking to us from the IMF meetings and with Francine Lacqua down in Washington. Now, in the meantime, let's check on the majors here. We can see the equities continue to trend down here. Markets started out relatively flat today, but it's been coming off, particularly you see with the NASDAQ there leading it. Tech companies are coming off, Microsoft in particular, perhaps because it had been up so far. In the meantime, we also have Boeing down now 3.6%. This was on a report that, in fact, Boeing now has turned over some instant messages that they found some time ago. They've turned them over to the FAA that suggests that some employees misled the agency about key safety aspects of the 737 MAX. Coming up on Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. We're going to hear today from JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon and Morgan Stanley CEO James Gorman. And this is Bloomberg.